The Battle of Ipsus, one of the most important engagements of the Hellenistic era, saw some 200 elephants pitted against one another in combat. These elephant warriors were primarily on the side of the coalition forces of Seleucus I and Lysimachus, though Antipater's army did have a few war elephants in their ranks as well. But how exactly were these 200 elephants used? Did they charge head-on into the enemy like in some modern cinematic depictions of war elephants? Or were they used more tactically? We'll tackle this question and more today. But before we get into it, let me just say that while I may not be an expert on war elephants, I do know something about history. So if you enjoy this video, please show your support. It really helps my channel grow. As mentioned earlier, the Battle of Ipsus saw war elephants playing a pivotal role on the battlefield, primarily on the side of the coalition forces led by Seleucus I and Lysimachus. War elephants were not just present at the battle, they were used tactically to great effect, helping to secure a decisive victory for the coalition against Antigonus and his allies. The Battle of Ipsus was fought in 306 BC between the armies of Seleucus I and Lysimachus, on the one hand, and Antigonus and his son Demetrius, on the other. The context surrounding the battle is quite interesting because it was part of a larger power struggle known as the Wars of the Diadochi, which took place after Alexander the Great's death. During this period, his former generals and companions competed for control of his vast empire. Antigonus, one of Alexander's close associates, seized the capital city of Babylon and assembled a formidable army, aiming to assert dominance over the other Diadochi. Seleucus, a general under Ptolemy I, recognized the threat posed by Antigonus and formed a coalition with Lysimachus, who controlled Thrace and was previously at odds with Seleucus. Now back to the battle itself. The fighting began with Antigonus's cavalry engaging Seleucus's forces. Initially, Demetrius, the commander of the cavalry arm of his father's army, enjoyed success and actually managed to rout some of Seleucus's cavalry. However, a contingent of around 300 war elephants played a pivotal role in turning the tide. These elephants, which were part of Seleucus's reserve, were deployed when Demetrius's cavalry advanced too far behind the main infantry force and became somewhat isolated by positioning their elephants strategically. The Seleucids effectively blocked Demetrius's path, preventing him from returning to rejoin his father's main force. According to Plutarch, who provides us with a first-hand account of the battle, the elephants, along with some infantry units, formed a protective barrier, safeguarding the baggage and the rear of the camp. However, the crucial element was their role in neutralizing Demetrius's cavalry, a key component of Antigonus's military strength. There are two important things to note here. First, despite being outmaneuvered, Demetrius wasn't defeated. His cavalry still engaged in combat, but without the ability to directly support his father's infantry. Second, it was around 300 elephants. This number alone highlights the magnitude of the elephant force and its potential impact on the battlefield. When used in tandem with other military assets like infantry, this elephant force could significantly disrupt enemy formations and strategies. Why were the elephants so effective against the cavalry? Well, it comes down to a simple: horses hate elephants. Elephants emit a variety of sounds during battle, but their size and appearance are what truly startle and terrify horses. The sight of an elephant charging with raised tusks and a roaring mouth is enough to spook any animal. Even if the elephant doesn't charge directly, the sheer presence of an elephant can make horses nervous. For cavalry troops, this fear means that they cannot approach elephants, making them vulnerable to attacks from the flanks or rear. As the cavalry attempts to flee, they become easy targets for missiles and javelins thrown by infantry. Antigonus's main force was composed of elite Macedonian infantry, often referred to as the companion cavalry, who were known for their discipline and skill in arms. These troops were responsible for securing many of the Macedonian victories during Alexander's campaigns and were considered some of the finest soldiers of their time. The presence of such a formidable infantry force gave Antipater's army a significant edge in the battle. However, as the battle progressed, the war elephants proved instrumental in countering the Macedonian infantry's effectiveness. The elephants' sheer size and strength allowed them to break through the tightly packed phalanxes, causing widespread panic and disruption. Their tusks and feet crushed soldiers beneath them, and their tusks shattered shields, leaving the Macedonian infantry vulnerable and demoralized. This tactic of using elephants to penetrate enemy infantry formations was a common one in ancient warfare, especially in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Elephants were valuable assets because they could break through defensive lines that would otherwise be very difficult to penetrate. Their ability to trample and gore infantry, coupled with their intimidating presence, made them potent weapons of war, in addition to their offensive capabilities. War elephants also played a crucial role in fortifying Seleucus's own infantry positions. For example, the elephants were positioned along the edges of the battle line, ready to reinforce any weak spots that might emerge. If the Macedonian infantry managed to breach a section of the coalition's line, the elephants could quickly intervene, using their tusks and feet to stop the advance and protect the vulnerable flanks of the phalanx. Another interesting aspect of the war elephants at Ipsos was their use in conjunction with archery. Elephants were often equipped with towers or platforms on their backs, which housed archers or javelineers. This gave the elephants an additional offensive capability, allowing them to engage enemy troops from a distance. Archers on the elephants could fire at enemy infantry, softening them up for a potential charge or providing covering fire for friendly troops. This combination of direct assault and ranged attacks made the elephants a versatile and adaptable force on the battlefield. In essence, the war elephants at Ipsus were not just brute force employed by Seleucus and Lysimachus. They were integrated into a broader military strategy that aimed to counterbalance Antigonus's advantages in cavalry and infantry quality. By using the elephants to control the battlefield, create openings for their own troops, and disrupt the enemy formations, Seleucus and Lysimachus were able to achieve a decisive victory despite facing numerically superior forces. If you enjoyed this video, check out my previous videos on military tactics in the ancient world. And as always, thank you for watching. The Battle of Ipsus is one of those battles where a few crucial moments determine the outcome. For example, if Demetrius had not been so trigger-happy when routing Antigonus's cavalry, the battle could have turned out very differently. And yet, although we talk about key moments in history a lot, we rarely consider how someone can influence such a key moment. And in this case, that person was none other than Seleucus himself. He realized what was happening on the battlefield and acted accordingly to turn the tide of war in his favor. In this episode, we will look at how he did it. As always, though, let's start with a brief overview of the battle itself. The year is 301 BC and the location is, as I said, Ipsus. The armies facing each other are mainly composed of two coalitions led by Attalus and Seleucus on one side, and by Demetrius and his father Antigonus on the other. These two coalitions came together due to a common enemy, namely the Diadochi of the Antigonid army. At first, they tried to keep things peaceful between them, but soon enough, disagreements over spoils started popping up. Before any open conflict could happen, though, they were confronted by the Diadochi army, which triggered a chain of events that led to the eventual coalition between Attalus and Seleucus. At the beginning of the battle, the allied cavalry on the left wing of Seleucus was almost completely wiped out by the best cavalry of the Antigonids under the command of Demetrius. As the allies were pushed back, the phalanx of the Antigonids on the right wing advanced forward, and they would have easily broken through the center of the allied line if Seleucus had not sent reinforcements there in time. So at this point, the allies were still holding on, but they were being slowly squeezed by the Antigonid army. Meanwhile, the Antigonian cavalry was also looking to finish off the remnants of the allied cavalry on the left wing. But little did they know that this was exactly what Seleucus wanted. You see, Seleucus kept a large number of war elephants behind the center of his army, and he now sent them forward towards the river. Their task was simple: to block the path of Demetrius's cavalry from returning to the battlefield. This may seem like a weird thing to do since elephants are slow and vulnerable to cavalry attacks. So, why did he do it? Well, there are a few things going on here. First, he wanted to cut off Demetrius's cavalry from returning to the battlefield because their presence on the right flank of the Antigonid phalanx was crucial for the overall success of the Anjou army. Second, even if they didn't manage to stop Demetrius's cavalry from coming back, the elephants would at least buy some time for Seleucus's cavalry. And finally, the elephants would force Demetrius to make a decision. He could either try to break through the elephant line and risk losing his cavalry in the process, or retreat and save his men. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. Some of the elephants were indeed broken through, but the majority of them remained intact and bought enough time for Seleucus's plan to unfold. In the meantime, while the elephants were holding off Demetrius's cavalry, Seleucus took advantage of the situation and started to harass the Antigonid phalanx. He knew that the phalanx was extremely vulnerable without cavalry support, and so he kept sending his cavalry around the right flank of the phalanx in big circles. This had two effects. On one hand, it kept the enemy afraid of a charge from the right flank, which made them constantly shift their weight to that side, making the phalanx unstable. On the other hand, it demoralized the Antigonid troops who had to deal with these constant jabs from the cavalry without being able to counterattack themselves because their attention was focused on the threat on their flank. Soon enough, the stress and pressure became too much for some of the troops who started to abandon their ranks and flee or even join the allied cavalry on the opposite side. Meanwhile, Demetrius on the left wing had to make a choice. Should he push forward and help his comrades on the right wing, or should he focus on securing his own position? He chose the former and started pushing forward with his cavalry. Yet he found out the hard way that it's impossible to coordinate movements with cavalry over long distances, especially back in the days when there were no telephones or radios. So when Demetrius reached the right wing, he was too late to be of any real help. Around the same time, something interesting happened in the center of the battlefield. While the fighting was mostly focused on the flanks, the Macedonian infantry in the middle more or less stood their ground. But then the royal brothers, Magas and Berenice, decided to take matters into their own hands and lead a surprise attack against the Antigonid center. They managed to get quite deep into the enemy lines before the rest of the army noticed what was going on. So when the infantry in the center saw the royal brothers returning from their deep foray, they thought that they were retreating from an enemy attack. Seeing this, the rest of the troops in the center started retreating as well. And so the whole front line of the Antagonids collapsed. This collapse created a void on the right flank, and this is when Seleucus finally decided to send his cavalry in for the kill. But it was already too late for the Antagonids. Even without the cavalry on their right flank, their infantry couldn't hold the pressure from the allied cavalry on the left. The battle was essentially over at this point. Antigonus himself tried to rally his troops and escape, but he was eventually killed by some Scythians. His head was cut off and sent to Persepolis as a trophy. So that's essentially the story of how Seleucus's cavalry won the Battle of Ipsus. We can identify 3 things that he did to achieve this victory. First, he baited Demetrius into attacking and pushing away from the battlefield his best cavalry. Second, he contained this same cavalry by using a large number of war elephants to block their path. And third, he harassed the exposed right flank of the Antigonid phalanx until it broke apart. All 3 of these steps were necessary for the overall success. Without the bait, Demetrius might not have pushed away from the battlefield so easily. Without the elephants, Demetrius would have been able to return to the battlefield and support the phalanx. And without the harassment, the phalanx might not have cracked as easily. Now, this last point requires a bit more explanation. You see, there's this misconception out there that the phalanx was basically unbeatable. But that's not really true. The phalanx could very much be defeated if attacked from the flanks or rear. Also, the soldiers in the phalanx had to be motivated to fight. This is why, for example, the sacred band of Thebes was so formidable. Their soldiers weren't just augmented by the use of the shield wall, but they were also willing to die for their way of life. The problem with the Antigonid phalanx was that it lacked that fighting spirit. Most of the soldiers were mercenaries who only cared about one thing, their pay. This lack of motivation played a big role in the demise of the Antigonid phalanx. In fact, throughout the ancient world, armies with disciplined troops were known to break through phalanxes with ease. Just think about the Celtiberians at the Battle of Carrhae or the Roman legionaries at the Battle of Chauronia. Both of these armies were highly disciplined, and both of them managed to destroy entire phalanxes. Now, don't get me wrong, the phalanx wasn't a bad formation. It was actually pretty good for its time. But the key to its success was having troops that were willing to fight and die for a cause. Without that element, the phalanx could easily crumble. And this is precisely what happened at Ipsus. So in the end, Seleucus didn't really defeat the phalanx per se. Instead, he exploited the weakness of the troops that formed it, and that is why his cavalry was able to dismantle it so easily. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider liking the video and subscribing for more historical insights. I'll catch you next time. What if someone gave you a chance to take out all your enemies at once, but with a catch? That the outcome would depend on a single battle where if you won, you would be victorious, and if you lost, you would be defeated. Well, that's what happened to the protagonist of today's episode, King Antigonus I Monophthalmus. Around 320 BC, Antigonus controlled Anatolia, the Levant, Cyprus, and parts of Mesopotamia. But he had three powerful rivals, Lysimachus in Thrace, Seleucus in Babylon, and Cassander in Macedonia and Greece. Initially, these three were united against him in a coalition, though after a while, Seleucus left and joined Antigonus. So now the alliance was down to just Lysimachus and Cassander. Still, this duo was dangerous enough. They controlled most of the important trade routes, especially those that connected the Aegean Sea to the Persian Gulf. And so they were threatening to cut off supplies to the Mesopotamian satrapies that Antigonus ruled. In addition, the two kings were marching on his allies. Lysimachus was advancing toward the Halys River in Anatolia, and Cassander was moving into central Anatolia. At the same time, there was talk that Perdiccas, the former regent of Alexander's empire and son-in-law of Cassander, was also planning to march east from Macedonia into Anatolia, so things weren't looking good for Antigonus. He was being attacked on multiple fronts by experienced commanders with large armies. And if the three rivals joined forces, he would be crushed. So when one of his generals, Ptolemy I, asked permission to campaign against the Egyptian pharaoh, who was also an ally of Lysimachus, Antigonus instead ordered him to go to Phrygia and protect his eastern border. With that, Ptolemy took an army of 60,000 men and marched north. Meanwhile, Cassander also moved north and pitched camp near the city of Sardis. Soon after, Lysimachus arrived too, and together they prepared for war. At this point, though, it seems that neither king wanted to risk a pitched battle. In fact, in ancient sources, we find arguments about which one was more skilled and cautious. Plutarch writes that Antigonus was hot-headed, ambitious, and eager to fight, but knew how to conceal it. While Appian writes that Cassander was the strategist of the bunch and afraid of losing. Polybius, on the other hand, says that it was actually Lysimachus who was the most prudent of them all. So perhaps it was Antigonus who initiated the first attack by crossing the Halys River and invading Phrygia. There he met the coalition forces in a plain near the city of Gordium. But even though he had an army of around 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, he didn't want to risk a battle. Instead, he stayed put and fortified his camp. On the other side of the river, Cassander did the same. And although Lysimachus advised caution, Cassander's generals convinced him to attack. According to Plutarch, they argued that since Antigonus's camp was on the far side of a river and behind hills, his cavalry couldn't roam freely or gather intelligence. So it was now or never. Of course, if Lysimachus was in charge, they would have tried to invest the camp and starve out Antigonus's army. But since Cassander was in command, they decided to attack head-on. And so at dawn, the coalition forces crossed the river and gave a battle cry. Then they charged and broke through the Macedonian center. On the right wing, they fought against Ptolemy, and on the left against another of Antigonus's generals, Nicanor. However, the rest of the battle went badly for the coalition. According to Plutarch, Nicanor routed the enemy on his flank and then charged into Cassander's camp. Seeing this, Ptolemy also left his opponent and joined Nicanor in attacking the headquarters. As the fighting intensified, Cassander realized that the battle was going badly and tried to escape on horseback. But soon his horse was killed and he fled on foot. He was eventually taken prisoner, along with many of his officers, and executed. Lysimachus and his generals fared no better. While he managed to escape from the battlefield, he was later captured by Nicanor and executed in a town called Elbe. In short, in spite of having a numerically superior force of 140,000 men and with a strong presence of war elephants, the coalition was defeated by Antigonos's army of 86,000 men. Yet the victors suffered heavy losses too. It is said that 10,000 men were killed and 4,000 wounded. But why did Antigonus risk this battle? I mean, sure, his victory secured his eastern border and dealt a death blow to his enemies. But the casualty count doesn't lie. His army was severely weakened. Well, there are a few reasons for this. First, Antigonus needed to crush all his enemies at once. If not, they would have simply regrouped and attacked him one at a time. And considering their proximity, it would have been easy for them to reinforce each other and coordinate their attacks. By comparison, Thrace and Greece were far away. This was not only because cavalry could operate more easily in open terrain, but also because open terrain forced his enemies to fully deploy their troops, including their war elephants. Otherwise, they would have used the hills to hide them and surprise him. Now, the reason why they had so many elephants is that Lysimachus, the king of Thrace, had originally been in a coalition with Seleucus, the king of Babylon, and Ptolemy, the king of Egypt. These three controlled the richest regions of the former empire of Alexander the Great. And thus they had the resources to maintain large armies with lots of elephants, whereas Cassander didn't have access to such resources. But why didn't Antigonus simply try to defeat them piece by piece? Well, that's a good question. And I think there are two answers to it. First, the generals of Lysimachus and Cassander were very capable and had experience commanding large armies. Remember that they were some of the senior officers of Alexander's army. And unlike Antigonus, they had been fighting in multiple wars for decades. Second, Antigonus had to end the war quickly. You see, even though he was skilled as a commander, the truth is that none of the major powers were willing to go to war with him. And the longer he hesitated, the more time his enemies would have to recover and rally their supporters. I mean, at the beginning of the war, as soon as he heard that Lysimachus and Cassander had formed a coalition, he should have immediately invaded Thrace, crushed Lysimachus, and then gone to help Ptolemy against the Egyptian pharaoh. But he didn't do that. And as a result, he found himself facing a coalition of three kings. The same thing happened with Seleucus. When he first entered the war, Antigonus should have chased him all the way back to Babylon and defeated him. But he didn't. And that's why he ended up facing two kings instead of one. Moreover, the longer the war dragged on, the more likely it was that the likes of Perdiccas would launch an invasion from the north. And if the former regent succeeded in reaching Anatolia, none of Antigonus's satrapies would be safe. That's why Antigonus's victory was so costly. He won the battle, but ended up with a wounded and depleted army. To make matters worse, he fell ill and died a year later in 319 BC. The irony is that he was the closest person to creating a new empire in the Hellenistic world, but his inability to see the big picture prevented him from doing so. Anyway, guys, that's it for today. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to see more content like this.